stop me in the street and hand me some, and I put it in my back pocket so I remember who gave me that. I used to be able, well, for a short time I could say Don's most recent book was the one from Ford, Husserl's Missing Technologies, but I can't say that for the past few years. So, just a few notes on our speaker. I expect we all know who Don Ihde is. I was privileged and had the great pleasure of coming to Stony Brook as part of the first graduate school graduate program in the philosophy department in 1971. And so I got to study with Don Ihde, and I still am. But as he's mentioned, now we learn from each other too. That was 71. Don is now a distinguished professor from Stony Brook, the distinguished professor. He is retired. That means he's traveling all over the world, and he's writing a lot of books. And though I am not going to read all of the titles, I'll just mention the 6th book on Ihde, Reimagining Philosophy and Technology, Reinventing Ihde, is about to come out shortly, very soon. That book number 24 was Medical Techniques. There are a few copies of those sitting around here. I was given one yesterday. Number 25, Material Humanities, is the halfway point, maybe the 3/4 point since we spoke last. And I think 26 is going to be Animal Techniques. Techniques. Right. I should learn to spell that. There's also a lot of honors that have been rightfully given to you. I'm thinking of the Distinguished Service Award from the Society for Philosophy and Technology in Darmstadt a couple of years ago. And this spring, I am pleased to say, Don will be elected as a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So, and we'll listen to Don now.
Thank you, Lenore. I want to say that Lenore will be the recipient of the Don Ihde Distinguished Alumni Award next month or a couple months hence at Stony Brook. And I'm very proud to have been one of her professors while she was a graduate student at Stony Brook. I established this award when I retired in 2012, and Lenore will be the 7th recipient of the award since I started giving them in 2013. So very proud to have Lenore as my moderator and introducer, and very happy to be back at the Silverman Center. I gave a lecture here some years ago on philosophy and ecology, phenomenology and ecology. Tonight I'm going to talk about post-phenomenology and postmodern technoscience, black holes, relativity, and quantum theory. I begin with the first image of a black hole. This was announced April 5, 2019, and the image was the result of a 15-year project which was started by a friend of mine, Peter Gallison at Harvard University. I regard Peter as one of the foremost philosopher historians of science of our time. He was a roastee in my technoscience research seminar, and is the author of a pile of books, including Image and Logic, in 1997. He pleads that he's only a small part of what were over 200 scientists who helped organize this image. And this image, which, as I say, was first revealed in April 5th, 2019, I think is one of the most important science images ever. It probably equals Rosalind Franklin's famous X-ray crystallography image of DNA, which was snuck a look at by James Watson in England. And I showed this image in Medical Techniques, by the way, if anybody's interested. And this was the image that showed the 2-strand rather than the 3-strand notion of DNA structure. So it's a very important image in the history of science. I have a theory which I'm trying to exposit in Material Hermeneutics, which I hope will be a capstone book. It's the one that Lenore mentioned. It's about 2/3 written at this point. My notion is that imaging technologies are the center of the new science, and these became central basically in the 20th and 21st centuries. They're brand new, and they give a precision to the kind of science that we've had previously, which has never been had before. It turns out that the black hole, for example, I'll refer to some of its background in the history of science, is dependent upon basically 20th and 21st century imaging technologies. I was surprised to learn, for example, that dating imaging, which is carbon-14, everybody knows, really didn't come into its own until the early 20th century. And as everybody knows, the structure of DNA was a discovery of 1953. So we're talking about very, very recent kinds of technologies that now give us the kind of knowledge that we've never had before of these various notions. And in this, the new science is, of course, relativistic from Einstein and quantum theory, and I'll be referring to that tonight. This first image of a black hole is one of the most complex images of science ever. It's taken of the largest black hole in the galaxy, the Messier, which is 55 million light years away. They chose the biggest black hole they could find because they, to image it, they needed a telescope which is actually bigger than the Earth. So what they did was they took 8 telescopes, various locations, Alaska, Antarctica, etc., and made them into a virtual single telescope, so that, for example, the 8 telescopes which were virtually connected by atomic clocks located also across the world, and the data was processed in tomographic computer systems, is supervised by 200 engineer scientists from the international network of collaborating countries. The eventual shot cost about $60 million. So it's a very, very expensive piece of work. And if you want a simple example of what it looks like luck-wise, just imagine having to have a clear sky at 8 distant points of the Earth all at the same time. Otherwise, you're not going to get a good image. So these 8 radio telescopes were spread over the entire Earth, coordinated through a computer tomographic system into a virtual single telescope, which took the image 55 million light years away. So the image you have is what occurred 55 million years ago, as far as chronological time is concerned. All this data coordinated had to have to produce the image, which is described as like reading the New York Times in New York projected to a sidewalk cafe in Paris. That's the degree of magnification that was needed. The process produced an image which depicts the surrounding gas around the shadow of a black hole 55 million light years ago. When I first saw it, I was blown away. And this was just the beginning, since they have discovered a black hole since that time, which has wobbling, Hawking radiation jets never before discovered. These jets are wobbling all over the place. And the next project of this set of 8, now 11 astronomical sites will be aimed at the black hole in the center of the Milky Way, which is a relatively small black hole compared to the one which was imaged here. Think now of Galileo at the beginning of early modern science, who with his early crafted handmade telescope was also blown away by the mountains and seas of the moon, the phases of Venus, the protuberances of Saturn, and sunspots, all of which he excitedly claimed were sights not described by Aristotle or the Bible in his hastily published 1610 Heavenly Messenger. Galileo built his first Galilean telescope for use in 1609. He learned about Lippershey's telescope in Holland, which was invented just the year before. And since he was a lens grinder and he made his own compound telescope, plus some microscopes. He had no idea of black holes, neutron stars, curved lights, trillion galaxies of 13 shapes of today's postmodern universe. His universe was totally different than our universe is today. He was an optically revealed new universe restricted to the same frequencies of white light that we embodied humans can see with the naked eye. In fact, all astronomical telescopy was limited to this range, narrow range of light that we could see until 1924. That's the first time that people recognized that there were at least two galaxies when Hubble named the Andromeda as the second galaxy. Today we have trillions of galaxies in the 13 shapes that I have referred to. Moreover, Galileo had no glimmer of how far away the nearest stars were outside the solar system. And of course, this is reflected in the smallness of his universe as he described it at the time. There were no means of measurement that were known that would make the universe bigger than it was for Galileo. What I'm trying to illustrate is that our universe revealed through relativity and quantum oddity is so much more radically different from Galileo's barely post-Ptolemaic universe than either is from the three-storied universe of biblical Babylonian cosmology of the 700 BCE Bible or those times. This was a three-story universe that had crystallographic spheres, all of which disappeared with Copernicus. Let me give one more preliminary illustration. In June, a special issue of Philosophy and Technology, edited by Oxford anthropologist Lambros Malafouras and me, compared both his notion of material engagement theory and post-phenomenology. Both of us came to the conclusion that we humans are what we are today by virtue of making tools, making, in his case, making knapped stone tools 1 million or so years ago, and in my case, looking at the way in which we make tools all the time. And we both argue that this shaped our bodies, are the very shape of our human bodies, which are very different and divergent from ape bodies, which were at the same time. Everybody knows evolutionarily that apes and humans separated about 7 million years ago. So we've had 7 million years of divergent bodily differences, made largely by our uses of tools, which are different. Animal technics, which has been referred to, will reflect the shocking news that came out while Lambros and I were doing this special issue. The shocking news was that tools were found, knapped stone tools were found that were 3.5 million years ago, which for those of you who follow anthropology know is about the age of Lucy. So Lucy's Anthropocene Australopithecine type proto-humans were the first to use nap tools. And what this implies, of course, as I will argue in Animal Technics, is that humans were very late in adopting technologies compared to our animal relatives. And I want to follow some of the implications of that. Now, this issue that emerged during our Homo Faber Revisited issue compares an anthropologist's material engagement theory with my post-phenomenology. Both emphasize how human tool or technology-making activity transforms both the world and humans in our way of being in that world. In preparation, I spent a lot of time researching how tool shaping reflexively changed both human and ape bodies. Following first Richard Wrangham's revolutionary book, Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human, 2010, this anthropologist surmises that once humans mastered fire, their diets followed a very different physiologies of food preparation and digestion, which in turn helped reform our bodies. Let me expand upon that a little bit. There's a problem here because the oldest archaeological evidence of controlled fire is only about 800,000 years old. And yet the modern human body goes back at least to Homo erectus, 1.8 million years. So we have a million-year gap. What Wrangham's students did then was to show that if you chop your food up, sort of Asian style, it has almost as many advantages for digestion as fire does. And so probably Homo erectus was busy creating Asian chopped food to help us change our bodies accordingly. And Saturday I'm going to spend a little time talking more about this in the Husserl's Missing Technology session, because since that time, a neurologist who's now at Vanderbilt has discovered that apes' body is on a different trajectory of development than humans. One of the points I'll make on Saturday is no ape can or does run marathons. Only humans run marathons. We're built to run. And this is a very sad truth for me to take because I don't like exercise. But we don't stay healthy unless we exercise, whereas apes are very lethargic and they can live quite well without exercise whatsoever. And it turns out that apes chew 6 to 8 hours a day. You know that none of us chew 8 hours a day.
How do you know?
And it's because we prepare our food very different than apes prepare their food. We have 26% faster metabolisms. We have small guts, small teeth, small jaw muscles, etc. Whereas apes have large guts, slow metabolisms, and so forth. So we are what we eat. If you add the notion of technologies and or fire, and this changes our bodily trajectory in terms of human and animal evolution. So, for example, if we compare our physiognomies with our closest animal relatives, the apes, which we are separated from by about 7.5 million years, we're strikingly different. And I just mentioned some of the differences. Apes, for example, have 26% slower metabolisms and chew up to 6 to 8 hours a day, compared to our roughly 10% of that. Our guts are small and short, and all of this made possible by easily digested food, in turn made possible by cooking and tools. There's one archaeological problem. Homo erectus, whose origins go back 1.8 million years, predates cooking by almost 1 million years. So if Wrangham is right, either humans used simple open fires earlier, or as two of his colleagues have shown, are using cutting tools to go back to the discovery of which today date now 3.5 million years to pre-Old Wattian tools, which are the oldest cast and found in 2016. There's more to this story of fire and tools which we have made, which in turn makes us bodily what we are, because the same story also applies to our cousin apes. Here, a comparative neurologist, Susanna Husel, is now at Vanderbilt, and I referred to her a bit earlier. Now, one of the interesting things has also been found in relation to human speech. For example, sounds in speech like F and V, which allowed for new words in more recent languages, and deeper smiles, pointed out in Science in 2019, page 1131. These changes in our very bodies in action took millions of years. Unlike the recent discoveries, for example, that straight black hair, blue eyes, and the ability to tolerate high altitudes are all less than 30,000 years ago. So the straight black hair which Asians have replaced curly black hair, which Africans and so forth had, are recent acquisitions evolutionarily. These recent changes are more closely related to environmental situations than to technologies. Now, 2 points. First, what is taken as both the world, the human, and technologies all show radical changes from era to era. Second, understanding these changes call for an interrelational analysis which looks at all of the elements for all of the changes all at the same time. Now, post-phenomenology. For brevity, historically, I began with the early 20th century. In science, this is a time of vast paradigm shifting. Einstein discovers special relativity in 1905, general relativity in 1916. I want to refer back to Peter Gallison, who did a wonderful book on Einstein's time and Poincaré's maps. What he does with Einstein is to show that the standard notion that Einstein is thinking out relativity, sort of as the great man with a great thought, is false. And that if you look at the patents that he's dealing with at the time, the patents are all dealing with railroad schedules, because the trains were running into each other a lot, and Einstein recognized that any kind of message, including light speed radios, has to undergo time. And so what he did was to recognize that train schedules had to assume a kind of universal time, and the universal time is what led to the notions of special relativity. So here's a case of, I would say, post-phenomenology in action, showing that what you're actually working on is what helps you formulate the notion, in this case, of special relativity. Quantum theory begins a bit later with Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Bern, and Jordan in 1925. Now, philosophically, note that this is the time of both phenomenology, Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty in Europe, and pragmatism, James, Dewey, and Peirce in America. Both of these were experience-based, practical-based philosophies, and both were in revolt against early modern Cartesian and Lockean thought. Intellectually, this was a very creative and exciting time, and I'd like to point out that whereas early modern epistemology in both Locke and Descartes held to an atomistic notion of what could be experienced, and to a subjectivistic and mentalistic notion of experience, phenomenology by the time of Merleau-Ponty developed an I am myself out in the world. I've always taken that as much more descriptive than I think, therefore I am. Everybody knows the Cartesian joke of being in a bar, and Descartes is asked, "Would you like another?" And he says, "I think not," and disappears. The sense of experience in both phenomenology and pragmatism followed relational analysis. In the case of pragmatism, it followed a Darwinian analysis of the organism in relation to environment. In phenomenology, it took the form of, in Husserl, ego cogito cogitatum, which remains, as I argue in my book, highly Cartesian. I'll try to show more of that tomorrow. Quite a few of the principles in both science and philosophy knew each other. I will note in passing that regarding science, that Europeans tended to focus upon physics, astronomy, and above all mathematics. And in some contrast, Dewey in particular focused upon Darwin, evolution, and environmental organism. I know too that Husserl tended to be most interested in what he regarded as a degradation of Western science, and Heidegger, of course, is usually considered the major founder of philosophy of technology. Now allow me to enter this scene. I'm usually identified as a third-generation philosopher of technology, or better, technoscience, also identified as one of the empirical turn philosophers in Hans Octopus's American Philosophy of Technology. And Bob Kreis is here, who is the translator of that book. He's one of the few people who could translate Dutch into English, and so we owe him part of that debt. In late life, I also published 2 books, critical retrospectives on my phenomenological mentors, Heidegger's Technologies in 2010, and Husserl's Missing Technologies in 2016. I mention these because in both I have chapters on their philosophy of science. I point out that both largely buy into the then early, almost universal 20th century mode of philosophy of science, which takes its main feature, mathematization. In Husserl's case, this is so far the case that I added another chapter based upon the crisis Husserl's Galileo needed a telescope. When he writes about Galileo, he talks only about his mathematization, not about his telescope. And yet Galileo himself in his diaries mentions that all 5 of his noted discoveries were made via the telescope. He also made microscopes, but he doesn't have too much to say about microscopes. I myself have actually used the Galilean telescope. I wrote Technology in the Life World in Italy, close to Florence, and so I was able to persuade the museum people to let me handle one of Galileo's remaining telescopes. He made over 100 telescopes in his life, and only a few still exist, and some of them are at the museum in Florence. Husserl ignores its role in favor of an ideal mathematization interpretation of science. Galileo himself admits that the sights of the phases of Venus, in his letter on sunspots in 1613, perceived telescopically were crucial in his switch between 1597 and 1610 between Ptolemy and Copernicus. And although I did not publish my judgment earlier, I believe that both Husserl and Heidegger were, sorry to say this, lousy historians of technoscience, of both science and technology. They didn't know much about any of the histories of these things. I only later realized both operated at very high altitudes with little attention to the specifics of either technologies or a praxis-oriented interpretation of science. Actually, the move which predates the naming of post-phenomenology, I realized, was already made in Technics and Praxis in 1979, This was a move to place technologies within intentionality itself. That is, in the notion of ego cogitatum, or being in the world, I place technologies within that as experienced ways of mediating the world seen through technological instruments. In its earlier Husserlian sense, intentionality remained within the umbra of the modernist ego cogitatum, and Husserl's formula was directed at things or objects. In my formulation, human technology, world technologies, play a different role than objects. They are means or mediations of how we experience things and the world, and only later did I realize that the 19th century electromagnetic spectrum precluded scientific phenomena like X-ray, gamma ray, or radio waves, and could only be experienced with instruments or technologies. Put negatively, classical phenomenology would have remained blind to instrument-mediated experience. This is a major point of Husserl's missing technologies. In contrast, post-phenomenology, with its focus upon contemporary technoscience, placed close attention to both specific historians of the histories of both technology and science. Here I list a few suggestive sources which highlighted major shifts in technoscience. These have frequently been cited and used in my own publications. I start with Technics and Civilization, 1934, Louis Mumford, who is usually identified as an intellectual historian, but sometimes as a philosopher. When I did my first philosophy of technology classes, he was considered the biggest name in the field. I liked his use of techniques, and 6 of my books now have the title Techniques in the title. The notion of techniques is to gain knowledge, you have to have some kind of material technology to mediate that knowledge. And so I like this term techniques, since it implied both the use of a material technology, and contrary, I didn't like the technology distinction used by many European authors of the early mid-20th century, and ended up titling 6 of my own books Techniques, as in acoustic techniques, embodied techniques, forthcoming animal techniques, medical techniques, etc. The later Mumford moved towards dystopian techniques more than the early Europeans. Most early Europeans were highly dystopian, including Ortega y Gasset and Heidegger, etc. It was Mumford who showed how widely and distinctly clock time, for example, was in transforming the whole of Western civilization. My second historical giant was Lynn White Jr., with his Medieval Technology and Social Change in '62. White showed how, in the High Middle Ages, there was a large machining technological revolution related to the paradigmatic change from largely human to animal, wind, and water power sources. Windmills, for example, created all the lowlands. Water wheels added mills, and animals frequently powered the cranes which are used to build cathedrals and various large architectural constructions of the Middle Ages. Karl Marx needs note for his famous developments of how technologies related to various forms of production. He recognized industrial revolutionary changes of power sources to coal and electricity, and although frequently too simplistically deterministic, plows and feudalism, factories and Taylorism, his approach clearly recognized the embeddedness of society with forms of technology. One could see Marxian emphasis as an early empirical terming. On a macro scale, Derek de Sola Price later popularized the term big science, noting the mega science projects which his first book shaped with the Manhattan Project, physics, engineering, and the atomic bomb, but later led to the transformation of biology with the Human Genome Project. My opening $60 million black hole image fits into this transformation, as does the shape of many 21st techno-science projects. Another of my favorites is Peter Gallison with his many books, among them, as I've already referred, Einstein's Clocks, Poincaré's Maps, 2003, which is close to post-phenomenology and showing how special relativity relates to Einstein's processing of patterns related to railway schedules, which stimulated his theory of special relativity. Another favorite paradigm-changing big science Manhattan project was the cancellation of the super collider. And I refer to Michael Reardon's The Demise of Superconducting Collider 2000, which deals with the U.S. Congress's cutoff of Cold War funds in 1993 of the super collider, an event which at the end of the Cold War sparked a very large reaction within the physics, engineering, and science community, with many moving into the life sciences. Then, as a sort of follow-up to Mumford, The Discoverers, 1985, by Daniel Boorstin. With a sketch as broad as Mumford, Boorstin follows a multicultural path of technology and science discoveries and impacts on the global scale. This concludes my often cited historians, although there are many more who were read and often reviewed over the years in the field. Finally, I want to point to weekly sources which feature science and technologies topics which keep one up to date. I refer to, for example, Science, Nature, The Economist with its quarterly technology reports, Scientific American magazines, which tend to be utopian, and the Tuesday New York Times science section, along with other occasional sources of article and contributions. Post-phenomenology, combining pragmatism, especially its critical aims, such as anti-foundationalism, anti-essentialism, and metaphysics, and its positive model of organ environment in an experimental context, added to the continuance of variational theory and its discovery first in experimental phenomenology in 1977. Later elaborated in many technology examples, places post-phenomenology in its philosophical history, which continues the interrelational ontology of intentionality, in turn incorporating technologies in use with special attention to practical perceptual skills needed to operate technologies, is shown in today's many case studies as relevant to contemporary technologies. I want to say that today we have a list of over 150 researchers doing SDS-type case studies on different technologies across the board, mostly contemporary. And so we're now a very serious movement within SDS, so science technology studies, across the globe. And we have our own publication now at Lexington Press, Lexington Books, on post-phenomenology and philosophy of technology. So I hope that we continue to grow and stay contemporarily oriented. I just finished a publication which will be out very shortly in the Jahrbuch Technik Philosophy in Germany, in which I argue with one of the German editors the differences between classical and post-phenomenology, and it's will be published all through Germany and the English language world. So hopefully people will begin to pay attention to the role of phenomenological analysis, post-phenomenological analysis of contemporary technologies.
Questions, comments, additions?
Would you tell us a little bit then about the relationship between post-phenomenology and phenomenology, and maybe a little bit of the history of the emergence of post-phenomenology?
Okay, the first thing I want to do is to enhance the differences. One difference, one of the things that I have continued with phenomenology to post-phenomenology is the use of a variational method. And I think variational method needs to be multicultural, because Westerners are not the only ones who have invented technologies, and humans are not the only ones who have used technologies. So I want variational theory to be very broad. And one of the things I discovered in experimental phenomenology, which was an analysis of what we would call multi-stable visual phenomena, or ambiguous drawings, is that they don't lead to an essence. I'm very much an anti-essentialist in the Rortian, Deweyan sense. And what they lead to is multi-stable phenomena. So that, for example, if you do my analysis of a Necker cube, for example, in its variations, I restrict myself to 5 variations instead of 3 in this book. So I discover multi-stability in experimental phenomenology. Subsequently, I worked the same thing with much more complex phenomena. For example, for many years I was a serious sailor, and I got very interested in alternative navigational methods, including the differences between South Pacific navigation and Western navigation. South Pacific navigation does not use instruments nor mathematics. And whatever mathematics it has is very, very simple. Instead, it learns to read natural patterns, such as wave patterns, wind patterns, bird flight patterns, etc., etc., etc. And so it turns out to be very, very different from European navigation. So I applied it to a multicultural, cultural problem, which is very much more complex than dealing with say, visual illusions, etc. One of the criticisms of experimental phenomenology is that visual illusions are too simple. And so I deliberately changed to a much more complex cultural pattern. And in material hermeneutics, I'm emphasizing that even more. Each chapter is based on using examples in a sort of SDS style. And one of the examples I use is the failure of civilizations, which is a pretty big example. Now, one of the failures of civilization has long been thought has to do with invasions of elites like kings, priests, etc. And so South American civilizations, Egyptian civilizations, Babylonian civilizations were interpreted in that way. Why? Because what they had were texts that talk about kings, priests, etc., etc. Now we realize that the civilizations probably did not fail for that reason. One of the reasons that many civilizations fail is their agriculture fails. And their agriculture is based on, in many cases, on irrigation. If you look at the movement of humans, you start with hunter-gatherer societies, then you move to agricultural societies which domesticate plants, etc. And this raises the level of food and other production so that you can have much more products to keep things going. But in this case, I'm using examples of failures of irrigation. In the case of Babylon, for example, it turns out that if you do an analysis of diatoms, everybody knows that the irrigation on the Euphrates, Tigris rivers failed because they became solidified. And you can trace this by diatoms in their tablets, because diatoms relate to degree of brackishness in the waters, and the more brackish type diatoms that you can find in the cuneiform tablets, the faster you can trace the salification of the water. So now in South America, a different phenomenon occurred. There, the irrigation system also failed, but they didn't realize that what was happening is that the Andes were rising with tectonic plates faster, and it reversed the water flow. So now we have to raise the question, what about irrigation in our civilization, which of course is Southwest America, California, etc. We may be facing the same difficulty, and this will affect our food production across the whole United States, etc. If the fires continue and climate change continues in the direction it was, we may face the same collapse of civilization that the past did, but for a different reason. So that's part of post-phenomenology. It all relies upon basically very, very contemporary kinds of knowledge produced, I think, largely by imaging technologies. So I would say multi-stability, the knowledge that's produced by imaging technologies at the micro level. We're just about to undergo a new change. I don't know if you know about, I have experienced it myself, I refer to it in medical techniques. In 2017, I experienced cataract operations. There are 3.5 million cataract operations in America every year. And mine was done just after the invention of a multifocal lens. Up until that time, you had to choose whether you wanted good distant vision or close-up vision. You don't have that choice anymore. You can choose a slightly more expensive thing, and they use a laser process, very fast laser process, which is 1,000,000 times faster and more accurate than its previous version. And so I don't need any reading glasses anymore. I can see the satellites of Jupiter without eyeglasses or telescopes, and so I have great vision. I wish they had the same thing with hearing aids. Which they don't. Yes. Speak up, because I do have hearing.
On the very issue of failed civilization and post-phenomenology, I'm wondering if you could take up your arguments about post-phenomenology directly with Husserl in The Crisis.
With
Husserl in
Yes.
The Crisis, where he says, yes, even if science has advanced in a phenomenological way beyond Galileo, he says that the effects of Galileanism have created a failed civilization. How do we turn that civilization around? Husserl's answer in The Crisis was that it was not through science itself, although you could humanize science, but it was only through a new humanism, a life inwardness and spiritualization, that you could get beyond this crisis, which of course all of us in this room are feeling right now in the same way Husserl was feeling it.
this is one of the big problems I'm facing in late life. I think that Husserl got the notion of the life world wrong. And so I think we need to revise the life world notion. Both Husserl and Merleau-Ponty argued that there is a strong difference between the life world and the world of science. And they chose their version of the life world as superior to the world of science. I think we need to rethink that.
Oh, I'm with you on that part, but
And,
the science has become like the sorcerer's apprentice, right? There's this whole process that in some
Well,
ways led to Donald Trump.
there's a part of me that wants to agree with that. I happen to think that the Greeks really led us astray. The Greeks led us astray by convincing us that there were entities that were non-perceptual, such as Platonic ideas and Democritean atoms, etc. And they loved robots. And they would love artificial intelligence and algorithms, etc. I think if we follow the Greek line, we're doomed.
But that's not the Socratic line.
That's, well, no, it's not the Socratic line, but it's certainly the Platonic line.
And so I could just put this in one more brief
One
way.
of
How is
my big
post-phenomenology better
late
than
life
transcendental?
arguments is what I call shelf life.
Uh-huh.
In studying the vast history of technologies and science, I realized that so many scientific objects no longer exist. Crystalline spheres no longer exist. Democritean atoms no longer exist, etc. They all went out of being. And nobody would think of a crystalline sphere as a scientific object anymore. And I think the same thing applies to philosophies, or should apply to philosophies. And I have an article which was interestingly published in the Chinese Marxist journal, Nature Dialectics, which argues for this perspective. So when I say we need to rethink the notion of the life world to include science in some sense, I'm not including all of science.
I was struck by the fact that you said about the adaptation of the human body to technology, and I assume you don't mean Lamarckian. I assume what you mean is that the environment selects. Now, once you accept that, of course you're familiar with Illich's notion of reverse adaptation, where we go from a tool to a machine, where we have essentially a tool that serves us, and then we live in a technosphere, and you see it in Charlie Chaplin's Hard Times, and you see it in so many different places, the way that we actually have adapted to the technology that we've adopted. So I wonder what you then think in terms of technological determinism, because if indeed the human body will in that sense evolve within the technological environment in which it finds itself, what about things like, say for example, the notion of ambition, which comes when you move essentially largely from a craft technology, craft technology, English surnames, Potter, Carpenter, Thatcher, God help us, Plumber, a baker, you did what your dad did. Now we get a new level of technology, and we get a notion of ambition. Once you get a notion of ambition, you get notions of goals and aspirations and so on. So it seems to me that there's a vast amount of, that's just one example. Another example would be something like this. Marx says, what does he say? The hand mill gives you whatever, and the industrial mill gives you industrial capitalism. Hand mill, you don't need much capital. Or a hand weaving machine. You invent a large weaving machine, now somebody else has got to own it, so you get capitalism. So I wonder whether you can say to what degree you think there's a level of perhaps technological determinism.
Well, I've spent most of my life being anti-dystopian.
Uh-huh.
I'm still fighting being dystopian. Let's take, for example, the displacement of human labor as an example. One of the great legends we have is John Henry. John Henry was the guy who was fighting against a steam-powered machine that drove railroad spikes, and he decided that it was putting people out of work and de-skilling them. Another example is male secretaries. As Kittler points out, male secretaries resisted typewriters because they de-skilled people. And so what happened? Secretaries moved from male to female within about 15 years because females were pre-trained, pre-skilled by playing pianos. And all of these females wanted to get out from domestic stuff, and so they became the secretaries of the new industry, etc. So I have always felt that any labor that humans do that is displaceable ought to be encouraged rather than discouraged. Now that we're talking about algorithmic kinds of stuff, I'm not so sure, because this may, I mean, in theory, for example, I have to confess, I love fast cars. And I love driving fast cars. And so the idea of a driverless car is really aesthetically bad to me. I don't like that idea at all.
They're testing them out in Pittsburgh, by the way.
Yeah, I've argued, for example, that a really good sports car, you can feel the difference between a head and tail when you drive over a coin, if it's a really good one. Whereas you can't do that with a heavy, big American gas guzzler, etc. So, so now, for example, one of the predictions is that if you get driverless trucks, you will displace about 9 million truck drivers in America. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Are driverless cars really safer than non-driverless cars? I think that remains to be seen. I'm not at all convinced that the driverless cars that decide it's better to kill one person than 5 people based upon a game theory is going to be very likely. So it remains to be seen. I have my questions about this, but I'm still fighting dystopianism, because I feel deep down that anything that a machine can really do better and faster and easier than a human ought to be allowed to do it, and we ought to find different ways to live. That's where I'm at so far.
Please have a question.
Oh, Don, I wanted to ask you about something you said at the beginning but didn't develop, which is that science is entering a new phase. There's a bunch of historians who are arguing that science is entering a new phase because of material science, which involves a different way of producing knowledge, a different interdisciplinary character, a different relation to industry. But you seem to think it's because of the role of images. Can you talk about that more?
Well, I've always been a phenomenological materialist, as over against the idealism of Husserl and Heidegger, etc. So that's why I like the term technics, because it implies a kind of materialism. And I think all technologies have a material element to them, including imaging. Now, what I'm claiming now is that the new imaging is going to move from current, let's say, million quanta to 10 million quanta or something like that, and it will become much more accurate, etc., involving it. So it's a kind of evolutionary rather than revolutionary, but we don't know what kind of instruments will be developed. For example, quantum computing. Quantum computing is likely to be much faster than ordinary computing, and is likely to be able to discover new means of quantification, etc. I'm not sure how revolutionary that is. I mean, Dreyfus and I were buddies for many, many years. We were both at MIT. I was there from 58 to 64. He was there from 60 to 68. And I got to know him very, very well during that period of time. And sort of, we went to gobs and gobs of conferences. And it was always amusing to me, because every time Dreyfus would say, a computer can't do this, this would set the program for computer designers for the next 10 years. And they say, I gotta prove Dreyfus wrong. But he's still right. The big strength of computers is calculation. I went to a conference in Twente, Holland, a few years ago, and they had an exhibit at the Frankenstein Museum with lots of videos of robots getting out of cars or trying to climb stairs. That was so funny, and this was Dreyfus's thing. He said it's much harder to simulate agile movement than it is to simulate a calculation. And he's still right. Still right. And although now we have drones the size of bumblebees, which can do all sorts of interesting things, we're still very far from agility. I mean, my dog is more agile than any robot I've ever seen. And so I still think Dreyfus has it right there. So I don't know what the new revolution will show. I'm very happy that I can see satellites of Jupiter without telescopes, but
Excellent. I'm going to yell so you can hear me.
Yeah.
So sorry to all the people I'm closer to. I want to actually ask you a question that touches on a few things that you've just said, but also on other things that you haven't said, because I'm totally not a nihilist or I'm not worried about them in the world. Even though I work on climate change, so maybe I should be. But as you know, I see you doing this, so I'm going to come closer. As you know, I also work in military ethics, and I don't want to talk about drones, but I want to talk about, Haraway a long time ago made this point, that the difference between machine and human is a contested border, it's a blurred border, it's not clear anymore. So at Case Western University right now, in the neuroscience department, they are developing technologies that haven't yet gone into testing, but they're still developing them to put brain implants into soldiers so that testosterone or something to keep you awake when you're on home mission, etc., can be triggered into the brain for the pilot or for the warrior. At the same time, these things you talk about in military actually have been developed now. And 2 days ago, I saw a video of a dog robot that can stand on its back feet and run like a person or run like a dog. And if it trips, it rolls and it stands up. So they're kind of getting there. But the only real problem they have right now with these robot soldiers is they can't tell the difference between a teenager and a combatant. So they're working with these robots and psychologists, etc., to try and make them get these robots to make decisions that are more like human decisions. So they are trying to turn the soldiers into robots and the robots into human. So I think that blurred line between machine and human being is becoming more and more fixed. And it's not becoming fixed on the side of the humans, on us.
if you go back, one of the things that Taylorism did was basically show humans how to be robots. I mean, what they did was to reduce labor to very simple movements, etc., so that the humans became robots before there were robots who replaced the humans. And I think this is a kind of illustration of the same. I mean, why we would want to do that is to me crazy. Why do we want to create these kinds of machines to begin with? This is anti. So right now I'm on a very humanistic kick, and my animal techniques. One of the things I want to argue in animal techniques is that we humans are basically evolutionary, similar to animals, and animal perception is our kind of perception. So, for example, animals are prey-oriented, so they need a kind of Merleau-Pontian perception which is able to tell figure against ground, motion, etc., etc. And the Merleau-Pontian kind of perception is so different from early modern perception of building things up from atomistic qualities, etc., etc. It's not the same at all. And so that's why I like Dewey and Husserl because they both are attacking that notion of perception. I think we should follow animal studies and the kind of animal perception that we all belong to. And if we do that, we'll discover that perception is not what the early modernists thought at all. It's more what Darwin thought. And if I'm right about animals for millions of years used technologies before humans did, we're very late to the scene. And this is another blow to human exceptionalism, if you will, because we're not the first technologists by any means. But no animal could ever do what Musk did, and that is send into space a robot who listens to rock music while in a spaceship. I mean, no animal is that stupid, and no animal is that wasteful. So I'm for sort of abandoning the hubris of Greek robotics, if you want to call it that, and getting back to animal wisdom.
We have no questions further on. In back, sir?
Yes, you please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for your talk. One thing I was wondering is if you have any thoughts on the, I guess this is an opinion question in some sense, right? What we're seeing is a trend where, right, in a sense, the human life world and the brain is becoming more and more fitted to technologies, right? And we're becoming, in some sense, more and more cyborg-like. Like kids nowadays, they're walking around.
You know what?
With this.
I think one of the most mythological things that we're being sucked into right now is to think that the brain is an executive organ. It's very Cartesian. That, as Merleau-Ponty points out, I think with my hands when I write. And I think that we're whole body distributed. The brain is not the central organ. And a lot of this stuff about cognitive science is sheer bullshit.
Right, I agree. I meant that kind of rhetorically because I also adhere to the inactive body tradition, cognitive science, Dreyfus and everything. My question is, I guess, a bit less nuanced than that. I'm wondering, seeing as how, right, there's an exponential increase in information around us and how people are becoming more and more immersed, right, in these informational media, and in some sense have a predisposition toward that kind of immersion. We're seeing how things like video games or like Netflix, right, there are certain kinds of addictions that are emerging as a result. Again, speaking to the maladaptive side of the phenomenon, I suppose. Do you see? I mean, I'm wondering, like, what are your thoughts about what's going to happen to humanity moving into the future, the promise and peril of this kind of trend, of this?
I'm going to reveal something that's personal. I'm one of the few people who doesn't have a cell phone. And I don't use social media. The reason for that is very simple. If I use social media, I would spend more time on screens. If I spent more time on screens, I couldn't write books. It's very simple, very pragmatic. I intend to write a few more books before I die. And I'm not against death. I think death keeps society going. If everybody lived to be even 1,000 years old, think of what this would do to the world. It would really be bad.
This, in a way, has nothing to do with your talk, but it does indirectly. I'm very concerned about what the UN tells us, that we are going to lose 1 million species to extinction within, I think, the next 2 years, and that we have very little time to keep the whole Earth from crashing. Can technologies help us out, or should we ask technologists to let it go And for God's sake, let more of these species survive who may well be more advanced than we are or could even dream to be.
I had a sort of conversion experience when I went to Africa for the first time. It's the first time that I realized that actually some animals have more claim to the earth than we do. And for the first time, I was aware that extinctions, I mean, you know why a lot of the animals are going extinct. It's because we're using up all their habitat. And they deserve their habitat. I grew up with animals on a farm in Kansas years and years ago. I rode a horse to a one-room country school. And horses are one of my favorite animals. Horses and dogs are so easy to communicate with. I just saw a dog tonight who knew that I like dogs, and he insisted on coming over. So I had to pat him. Horses are the same thing. The horses and dogs understand humans without language. And so when my wife and I take horseback rides in places like New Zealand or Australia or places like that, they always give her the most docile horse because she's inexperienced. They always give me the meanest horse because I'm experienced. But I know how to communicate with the horse. And so we agree that we're going to do things that the horse likes. And the horse always loves it. And so it's, I mean, I agree with you. I think this is one of the great tragedies of the 21st century is, again, it relates to animals, because animals are our peers. I think any animal in its animal, I happen to think that Heidegger is a lousy philosopher of technology, but he's even worse as a philosopher of animality. That's a really horrible part of his attitude towards things. Animals do not have a small world. They are able to move in their worlds very nicely, and they're very nicely adapted, at least as smart as we are.
Just a little speculation on this. There are at least two people in this room that are old enough to remember the old television show called The $6 Million Man Show. If there are a few more, they can keep it to themselves. Watching that show was my introduction to philosophy of technology. Because the voiceover at the beginning of that show starts with, "We have the technology, we can make him better than he was." And there were a lot of the episodes that the theme of the episode was, is that really better? And there were some of the episodes that showed people that were made in $6 million men also, who were driven crazy by it. Some wanted to take over the power of the world. I mean, it was clearly the elephant in the room was, what's better me? And what I was thinking when you, toward the end, especially toward the end of your talk, I'm completely in agreement with you that if you're going to make any sense at all out of the way in which technology and human beings are related in world experiences, you're going to have to assume that you can't say anything about either world or human beings or technology unless you say something about all three. About all three. In other words, if you have any desire to stay within the modern paradigm of I'm over here and there's a thing out there and I wonder if they're related somehow, you're already dead. You can't possibly understand the way technology enters into life. But the question I've got is, since there is this three-way interaction, it's not the right word, but because it needs to be more intimate than that. But since there are these three elements working always together, in the middle of their working together, there are all kinds of notions of what's good and bad coming up. Where do they come from and how do we evaluate them? For some people, that voiceover is absolutely the future. And for some people, it is precisely the worst possible danger that can arise. Where do we go to talk about that? We can't go back to some foundation somewhere. Rory's absolutely right. We're non-foundationalists all the way down, right? And on the other hand, letting this just be dictated by whatever the present interactions with technology are, leaves us with anything goes.
One of the interesting things happening in my late life is argument with lots of people. And one of the most interesting conferences was in Nijmegen, Holland, a few years ago, where Stiegler and I squared off. I've squared off with lots of people in the world, including Kurzweil and many of these people. And Stiegler was there. And he started out with an appeal to Prometheus and Epimetheus. And I said, I'm going to foreclose all of this mythology stuff. It's time to get rid of mythology. And I'm quite convinced that we have gobs and gobs and gobs of overlaid mythologies. It's time to get rid of those. And so that's part of the answer. That's why I've turned sort of anti-Greek in my old age.
Leave Socrates alone.
And I think the Greeks have misled us more than, and we still have this great Western adulation of the Greeks. Unfortunately, the worst of our ilk are the Germans. And I'm a German American myself, so when I went to the Pinakothek, I saw it all. If you go to the Pinakothek, it's a great neo-Roman edifice. And you climb up these great stairs, and right inside the front door is a restored Greek temple with statues painted and everything. And I thought, this is German civilization swallowing the Greeks and trying to keep us alive with this tradition. And one of the references I make in several of my publications is, you know, when Heidegger extols Greek temples, what he doesn't realize is that the stone temples are stone because the Greeks have decimated all the forests. And so the stone temples still show the pegs carved in stone that were from wooden temples before. And so these temples themselves are already images, if you will, telling us that this is because of a decimated environmental policy of our forefathers.
I know that we have a reception when the session is over. Are we ready to receive?
Yes.
Give you a break. Thank you, Don.